is Erik Kuhonta. I'm the director of McGill's Institute for the Study of International Development, and I'm also an associate professor of political science, work largely on Southeast Asian politics. Our roundtable today is on democracy, the state of democracy and human rights in Asia, and I'm delighted that we have this opportunity to discuss the current undermining of democracy and human rights in the past years in Asia. Now, this backsliding of democracy and liberal rights is a global phenomenon, but it is especially acute in Asia, where democracies have always stood on precarious grounds. In this roundtable webinar today, we're going to look in particular at Hong Kong and China, at Thailand, at Cambodia, and Myanmar. With us today is a very distinguished group of panelists to lead the discussion. These include individuals who are academics, activists, politicians, civil servants, government officials, and all of them, in fact, carry different hats at different times and have served in different capacities in these roles that I have just mentioned. So what we have is really distinguished intellectuals and practitioners of Asian politics. I will start by introducing each speaker in the order in which they will speak, and then I will just briefly discuss the protocol for this webinar. Our first speaker is Alejandro Reyes. He is a director and professor at the Asia Global Institute, a think tank at the University of Hong Kong, where he manages the Asia Global Online Journal. He's also a fellow of the Canadian International Council. Prior to this, working with the Institute at the University of Hong Kong, Reyes was in Global Affairs Canada, which is the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. And in this capacity, he served for 2 years as senior policy advisor to the Assistant Deputy Minister for the Asia Pacific. Al Reyes has edited and written several books, including a short history of Manila in the closing days of the Japanese occupation. He began his professional career as a journalist with Asia Week magazine, and he worked from 1988 to 2001 in Hong Kong and Singapore. Born in the Philippines and a citizen of Canada, Al was educated at Harvard and the University of Oxford and was awarded an honorary doctorate by Queen's University in North Carolina. Our second speaker is Tyrell Haberkorn. She is a professor of Southeast Asian Studies at the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures at the University of Wisconsin. Tyrell researches and writes about state violence and dissident cultural politics in Thailand from the end of the absolute monarchy in 1932 until the present. Tyrell is the author of 2 books, On Thai Politics, Revolution Interrupted, Farmers, Students, Law and Violence, and In Plain Sight, Impunity and Human Rights in Thailand, which was published recently in 2018. She's currently writing a first draft of an indictment of the National Council for Peace and Order, which was the military junta that took power in the May 2014 coup. Tyrell is a prolific writer and has written and translated frequently about Southeast Asia for a public audience, including in outlets like Dissent, Foreign Affairs, Prachatai, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. And she is also translating an important prison memoir of a Thai activist. Musa Kua is a Cambodian politician and rights activist. She was a member of parliament for Battambang from 2013 to 2017, and also previously from 1998 to 2003. She was a member and vice president of the Cambodian National Rescue Party until its dissolution, and previously a member of the Sam Rainsy Party prior to its merger with the Human Rights Party. Musa Kua served as Minister of Women and Veterans Affairs in Hun Sen's coalition government from 1998 to 2004. She's currently one of 118 senior opposition figures serving a 5-year ban from politics following a court ruling in 2017. Musa Kua has won numerous awards for her work on human rights. These include the Leadership Award in Washington, D.C. from the Vital Voices Foundation, co-founded by Hillary Clinton. In 2005, Sochua was one of 1,000 women nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for her work against sex trafficking of women in Cambodia and Thailand. And this work included creating and passing the Prevention of Domestic Violence Bill, which imposes severe penalties on marital rape and abuse of minors. Her other awards include the Elise and Walter Haas International Award from the University of California, Berkeley for Distinguished Record of Service in Cambodia, the Eleanor Roosevelt Award from George Washington University for Leadership in Human Rights, the 2010 People's Choice Honoree of the Global Exchange for their Human Rights Heroes Award, and in 2015, Sochua was honored by her alma mater, San Francisco State University, as the Alumna of the Year. And our fourth speaker is Yawnghwe. Yawnghwe is the Executive Director of the Euro-Burma Office, an independent international Burma policy think tank, democracy and human rights defender, and a peace-building organization. It was founded in 1997 in Brussels by the Associates to Develop Democratic Burma based in Canada. Han has been deeply involved in democracy building and peace building in Myanmar. In 1990, Han started a worldwide campaign to support Aung San Suu Kyi and restore democracy in Burma. He became senior advisor to Prime Minister Dr. Sen Win and represented Aung San Suu Kyi at the Nobel Peace Laureates Conference in 1998. In 1999, Han established a national reconciliation program that sought dialogue between Senior General Tan Shwe and Suu Kyi. It also sought dialogue and reconciliation between Rakhine and Rohingya resistance armies, as well as other ethnic armies in the government. After 48 years in exile campaigning for democracy, Myanmar's government asked Han in 2011 to help facilitate peace talks to end the 6 decades-old civil war. As a consequence, the Euro-Burma office established 32 liaison offices of 10 ethnic armies that have bilateral ceasefire agreements with the government of Myanmar. Han was educated in Myanmar, in Chiang Mai, in Chulalongkorn University in Thailand, and holds degrees from McGill University. I went through a relatively longer discussion of the bios of the speakers just to emphasize how lucky we are to have such a distinguished group of speakers today. I will just end by stating the protocol for this webinar. Each speaker will have 12 minutes to speak, and we will end the set presentations by approximately 1 p.m. At 1 p.m. we will move to discussion around that time. The participants' microphones will all remain muted. When we come to the Q&A discussion period, please raise your hand with the raise hand function. If you'd like to ask a question, I will then call on you, and you'll be asked, you'll see on your screen, you'll be asked by the host to unmute. You will then be muted after the question has been asked. Please make sure to ask a question and to keep it concise. The chat is closed and is only will be maintained by the moderator. I will leave it at that and ask the speakers to now move to the panel. And our first speaker will be Alejandro Reyes.
Thank you very much, Erik. Merci. C'est un grand plaisir d'être ici pour ce webinaire. Pleasure to be here. It's very late for me, so if I should nod off in the middle of everything, I apologize. Now, I just want to stress at the start that I'm speaking only for myself, not for the University of Hong Kong or for the Canadian government. In my comments, allow me first to say a few things about democracy and human rights in Asia, and then I'll speak about China and indeed Hong Kong. Firstly, what I would say is something pretty obvious, that Asia has really a wide variety of political systems, many with the institutional trappings that one might use as benchmarks or standards for assessing the quality of democracy, and each system has flaws. Now, you can, as I noticed, you have a wide variety, so extreme. So North Korea is certainly at one extreme where you have essentially a totalitarian system, although it's called the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. But we have quite a bit of different kinds of systems, different types of democracies, different types of political systems. Consider Japan, for example, which is often regarded as a key defender of the liberal order in this part of the world, in Asia. Indeed, the ruling party is the Liberal Democratic Party. But Japan is sometimes termed, if I could use the phrase that TJ Pemple used, an uncommon democracy. It's a democracy with a multi-party system that yet has fairly consistently returned a single party to power, albeit often in coalition, except for short periods when the LDP rule was sort of unbroken. But the LDP has been in power pretty much for most of the post-war period. But think about it. Japan in the last year plus or so has had two prime ministers not chosen by the people, but by party members. Indeed, the new prime minister, Kishida Fumio, was widely known not to have been the popular choice. So in this respect, we can see certain flaws in the democratic system that Japan has. And indeed, on issues of rights, Japan still has, by most accounts, a long way to go in outstanding issues related to, say, women and minorities. Take Korea. Now, again, has had a very compelling narrative of transition from authoritarian system to a democratic system, but yet bedeviled by imperfections. Presidents have been jailed for corruption. Indeed, two are in prison right now, I believe. Two former presidents are in prison right now. One former president committed suicide. And the issue of business government collusion and how that affects the quality of the democracy in South Korea it has been much debated. So it's a fair debate as to whether the situation has really improved and what is the direction of the quality of the democracy in South Korea in recent years. As far as human rights is considered, there's an ongoing debate right now in Korea about an anti-discrimination bill, which has been prompted by the death of a 23-year-old transgender person who was discharged from the army. This bill was actually introduced way back in 2007, but there has been strong opposition to it, especially from the religion lobby, from the religious lobby, largely because of antagonism against the LGBT community. Which brings me then to Taiwan, the only polity in the region where same-sex marriage is legal. Now in Taiwan, we have seen a two-party system emerge. The parties have moved in and out of power, the KMT and the TPP. There's a woman leader right now in Taiwan, but yet the imperfections are evident. Money politics has been a problem. We remember the fist fights in the legislature. Think about just a few years ago, the Sunflower Student Movement, where the cleavage issue was about relations with the mainland. And that created some difficulties or stresses in the political system there. Consider Mongolia. The politics has really opened up, and since in the last few decades. But in recent months, in fact, we've seen questions raised about the direction that Mongolia is going. In the 2020 parliamentary election, the Mongolian People's Party won 62 out of 76 seats. And prior to that, there had been moves by the MPP to push constitutional amendments to limit presidential term and to disqualify previous presidents from serving again. And the result is that you have what might be called, if you go back to British politics, Lord Hailsham, the former Lord Chancellor, called the elective dictatorship, where you see a duly elected political party, but in great numbers, pushing changes, constitutional changes that are raising questions as to whether Mongolia may be turning into a one-party state. Now, I don't think I need to talk too much about, say, Singapore or Malaysia, where we see basically Westminster parliamentary systems, but yet with well-entrenched ruling parties. Indeed, in Singapore, the political action party, the ruling political action party, has been in power really since even before independence. And in the 2020 election, I believe they had about, I think, 83 seats versus the Workers' Party, opposition Workers' Party, 10 seats. The vote share of the PAP came down to its lowest since 2011. You look at that system, and it is in some ways a flawed kind of semi-democratic system where the ruling party has inbuilt advantages that allow them to perform very well in elections. And the opposition parties face certain hurdles in getting their message across. The prime minister, for example, can call an election on short notice. The opposition is fractured. And we see efforts to introduce laws that the opposition has found somewhat onerous in terms of giving, in terms of limiting their ability to reach out and interact with the people. So, for example, the fake news law recently passed is one such piece of legislation. Just in the last couple of days, foreign interference bill has been passed, and many questions have been raised by that. Now, I won't even get into things like the Internal Security Act in Singapore and indeed in Malaysia as well. Malaysia, we see a ruling coalition led by UMNO in power for most of the post-independence years, which this ruling coalition collapsed in 2018. But then now we see another prime minister from the UMNO party has recently taken over. So again, constitutional system, but with flaws. And how does that actually work in terms of what is the direction of the quality of democracy that we're seeing? And in Malaysia, it looks to be right now in a very sensitive period where there was a flowering of democracy in 2018 with the opposition beating the entrenched coalition, but now the entrenched coalition back in power. So we see everything very delicate. India, even if I move there, we're within the constitutional framework. There are accusations that the current Prime Minister Modi, has created what some are calling a populist dictatorship, staunchly Hindu nationalist regime that has really unsettled minorities, including 200 million Muslims in India. I commend a recent book by a friend of mine, a journalist called To Kill a Democracy by Debashish Roy Chaudhary and John King, which looks really at how within this constitutional system, the world's largest democracy, as is touted, that this Modi's regime has inflicted certain wounds to the democratic system. Let me then turn for the rest of my time to what's going on in China. Now, I'm not sure there's really much to say aside from the fact that China is clearly a one-party state, the Communist Party at the top. The party is the government. It is through the party structure that leaders emerge. And currently there is a view that Xi Jinping is the strongest leader since Mao Zedong. Now, one can question as to the extent of his power. Most people these days point to the end of term limits as an example of where he's tightened the screws on the political system. He's taken a tougher stance on corruption. He's taken a tougher stance on Taiwan and taken a tougher stance in diplomacy with the outside world. Which then brings me to Hong Kong. In the last few minutes, let me quickly talk about that. In Hong Kong, the political system has always favored the executive, with the legislature, even with significant presence of pro-democratic forces, really not so powerful. But the legislature can hinder government initiatives. Now, this has happened in the past with national education legislation in 2012, with Article 23 security legislation in 2003, and indeed with the anti-extradition legislation, case in point, that led to protests in 2019. That led to the clampdown with the introduction of the national security law in July last year, which took effect in July last year. And we've had one conviction under that law. A gentleman was sentenced to 9 years in prison for running a motorcycle against police and waving a flag with an illegal message. Newspapers have been closed. Apple Daily has been closed, for example. I think the way to look at Hong Kong is that we're in some ways turning into Singapore, that there is some kind of constitutional framework, and we're shifting into some kind of constitutional authoritarian system where we still maintain certain level of freedoms, but there has been some containment of areas in which the government is concerned for national security, for security reasons. So the ambiguity of the national security law is the key. The ambiguity is what is meant to deter people from taking steps that would be unacceptable to the government. Lastly, I would just make this point. I'm going to borrow from my colleague in the Faculty of Law, Professor Cora Chan, who talked a few months ago in a workshop on the NSL about Ernst Frankel's dual state model. And this is kind of what I think is happening in many polities in this part of the world, and certainly in Hong Kong, where you have a normative system and a prerogative system. These two, Frankel talked about the dual state, the normative state and the prerogative state. The key is what can happen in terms of the normative state working within that prerogative state that's growing, that's getting stronger, but possibly. The key then for citizens is what can they do to strengthen, to defend, to expand even that normative state. And that means what can we do to strengthen rule of law? Because remember that with the NSL, regardless, the common law remains the underpinning of Hong Kong's legal system. So we really need to still see what happens. I would say that the outlook at the moment is really not good. There's a sense of restlessness here in Hong Kong, many people leaving the city. But again, the key is that we're not in any way at the moment living in a police state or a totalitarian state. That's kind of language that you will see in the Western media. But it's important to understand that the normative state, the normative system still exists, and it's not been snuffed out completely. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Al. We'll turn to our second speaker, Tyrell Haberkorn.
Thank you so much. Let me go ahead and share my screen. I just wanted to start by saying thank you so much to Professor Erik Kuhonta and the Institute for the Study of International Development for the invitation and for organizing this event. To turn very quickly to Thailand, since the 19 September 2006 coup, which was Thailand's 12th since the end of absolute monarchy on the 24th of June 1932, and especially since the 13th and most recent coup on the 22nd of May 2014, Whenever I talk about human rights in Thailand, I'm caught between focusing on the daring and courageous work activists are doing to make the promise of rights real, and focusing on the harsh repression perpetrated by those activists, perpetrated by the state against those activists. Today is no different. And in a sense, I think the tension between the people and the state and the possibility for either progressive transformation or tremendous repression is the most hot that it's been in the last 15 years. The broad context, which some of you who follow Thai politics may know, is that a remarkable youth-led democracy movement began in mid-2020. The movement has three demands. First, the current Prime Minister, General Prayut Chan-o-cha, who was put in place by the 2014 coup, somehow managed to retain his position even through elections in 2019, must resign. A new constitution must be drafted. Again, the most recent constitution, 2017, was authored by a junta-appointed body. Third, the monarchy must be reformed. This third demand is where the transformative power of the movement comes from, and where we can say that activists are working to make real the promise of the People's Party who fomented the transformation from absolute to constitutional monarchy in 1932. The call for reform of the monarchy is also where the dangers to the liberty and lives of the movement's leaders arise. So in the remaining time, I want to expand on the state of human rights and the possibility for transformation through 3 points. First, talk about suppression of political freedom. Second, talk about the resurgence of the use of Article 112, the lèse-majesté law. And then third, finally conclude on a note of hope and the possibility of accountability for state violence. So to start with suppression of political freedom, in March 2020, at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, the emergency decree was put in place and it's still in power. It gives authorities a really wide range of powers to arrest, search, constrict movement, etc. Although it was ostensibly put in place to prevent the spread of disease, in fact, what it's been used most for over the past year and a half has been to stop protests and also to create the context in which there's been a tremendous expansion of the use of riot police against peaceful protesters, water cannons, tear gas, rubber bullets, chemically laced water, etc. In addition, arrests have been ongoing and fairly constant. According to Thai Lawyers for Human Rights, an advocacy and documentation organization, by the end of September 2021, at least 902 protesters have been charged under the emergency decree, as well as 106 under public assembly laws. To give you a snapshot of more recent events, in August 2021 alone, as the pandemic itself has dramatically affected people's daily lives and created a great deal of tension in certain working class communities around Bangkok, in an area of social housing flats, Dindang, that has become a nightly site of protest between residents and police. In 1 month alone, at least 260 people were arrested, including 70 children, and at least 115 people, including 31 children, were injured. Second, perhaps of even greater concern is the resurgence of the use of Article 112 or the lèse-majesté law, which criminalizes speech and action deemed to insult, threaten, or defame the king, queen, heir apparent, or regent, and gives a punishment of 3 to 15 years per count of violation of the law. The law isn't new. It's been part of the Thai criminal code since 1957, but it wasn't used extensively until the September 2006 coup. Very significantly under this law, innocent verdicts are rare. They're almost impossible. But then, quite surprisingly, following the death of the previous king, Rama IX, in 2016, and the ascent of the current king, Rama X, there was a nearly 2-year pause in the use of the law. However, this changed in November of 2020 as the protests calling for reform of the monarchy gathered energy and support. General Prayut then announced the resumption of the use of the law. Since then, Thai Lawyers for Human Rights has reported that at least 124 people, including 8 children, have been charged with violating the law. Let me just mention details of some of the cases that the 5 people you see in the slides are facing. On the left is Anchan, who is a 65-year-old retired civil servant who was sentenced to 87 years in prison in January of 2021, the longest sentence to date for 29 counts related to online posts. Her sentence was halved because she confessed. The 4 in the photograph on the right, Panupong Jatnog, Parit Chiwarak, Panusea Sitijire Watanakun, and Anon Nampa, are 4 of the key activists who have pushed for the reform of the institution since the middle of 2020 and are at threat for doing so. Panupong, Parit, and Panusea are student activists, and Anon is a human rights lawyer and poet. For their role in peaceful protests since mid-2020, Parit faces at least 20 Article 112 cases, Anon 14, Panupong 9, and Panusea 8. To give you a sense of what that means, if convicted in all cases, Penguin could be sentenced to 300 years in prison. Under the Thai Criminal Procedure Code, the maximum sentence is 50 years. So 300 is more, to give you an idea of what he's facing, sort of in a more symbolic sense. That said, 300 years, 50 years for peaceful expression of opinion. In addition to the difficulty of securing innocent verdicts in these cases, bail is almost always denied. And today, Panupong, Parit, and Anon are all behind bars, denied bail prior to even the beginning of their trials. The call for reform of the monarchy really began in earnest on the 3rd of August of last year at a protest at the Democracy Monument in Bangkok, when Anon, the poet and lawyer, dressed as Harry Potter, got up on stage and shattered the ceiling of silence around the monarchy and Thai politics by calling for open, frank discussion. He explained that he was making this call out of respect for himself and for the institution. He then explained what open discussion was and why it was important. And I want to share a part of his speech with you now. He said that, quote, "Open discussion is not the toppling of the monarchy, but it is talking about it so that the monarchy will exist in Thai society in a manner that is correct and legitimate for a democracy with the king as head of state. All of the students who came out to protest after the new year are aware of this. Do not leave it to those on the margins to have to talk about the monarchy and then face threats and harassment all alone. Do not leave it to the political exiles to talk about the monarchy and then be brutally murdered and disappeared. From now on, this is not going to happen anymore. From now on, no one who comes out to talk about the monarchy will be accused of being crazy or insane and scooped up and put in the hospital, even though they spoke the truth," unquote. To emphasize Anon's words, do not leave it to those on the margins or those who are under threat to raise these questions. And to add to his words, do not leave those locked up for daring to do so behind bars. Call for their release. And I would urge all of us who are outside to do so as well. So by way of brief, hopeful conclusion, yesterday was the 45th anniversary of the 6 October 1976 massacre at Thammasat University. During the massacre at the height of the Cold War, right-wing state and parastate forces brutally assaulted, murdered, and lynched progressive students whom they accused of being communists who were out to topple the monarchy. The official number of those killed is 46, although the actual number is likely much higher. After the massacre, in addition, students were imprisoned. The perpetrators of the massacre walked free then and have continued to do so until today. Something quite remarkable happened yesterday, though, and the image that you see is part of the commemoration that was held at Thammasat. It's a public art piece that was created that is a photograph of one of the trees that students were hung from. And it's the last 45 years of the history of the tree is shown in this very long vinyl poster attached to the gates of the university. But what was remarkable about yesterday's event, and I should note, for the first time, there were commemorations of the massacre held throughout the country, in Bangkok, in Chiang Mai, in Ubon, all in Khon Kaen, all around the country. But I was listening to a live feed of the protest. I was still in quarantine, actually, so I wasn't able to go listen in person. And one of the young student activists speaking said at Thammasat, he said, those who were behind the massacre must be held to account. That hasn't been able to be said in public before. In fact, an editor went to jail for 7 years for publishing an article that made that same call. As I listened to the student, one, I was quite amazed by his courage in making that call. Also amazed that now, after a year and a half of protest, that call has been one that has become quite common and that you hear a lot. This strikes me as incredibly hopeful. I think the sense among many democracy activists in Thailand is that this is a long game. A year ago, I think it seemed like transformation was right around the corner. Now, the sense that this may take a while has set in, but I feel quite hopeful and quite humbled and in awe. I would like to stop there. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Tyrell. We will move to our third speaker, Musa Kua.
Thank you, Erik. A good afternoon to all of you from Rhode Island. It is not my choice to spend the rest of my life in America. My only choice is to be in Cambodia, where I was born, raised, and fought and learned so much from my people. Today, I'm here to speak and to share with you and with other panelists who just talked about the situation of human rights and democracy in Asia, in Southeast Asia. My sharing is very much personal, and personal because I lived through through human rights abuse, through the fight for democracy, and now my life in exile because, like the leaders of the opposition party in Cambodia, I have been sentenced to 22 years in prison for our only crime is to defend the dignity, the liberty, the freedom of our people and democratic values. Today, we're talking about Cambodia, a Cambodia that was totally torn by just 4 years of genocide that killed over close to 2 million people, including my parents and many, many of my relatives. Concerned by the tragic conflict and continuing bloodshed in Cambodia, the Paris Conference on Cambodia was convened at the invitation of the French government in order to achieve an internationally guaranteed comprehensive settlement, which would restore peace to Cambodia. On the 23rd October, in a couple of weeks from now, we will commemorate the 30th anniversary of the signing of the Paris Peace Accord. When we talk about conflicts in Cambodia, we must never, ever forget and never, ever let a genocide return to Cambodia. When we talked about armed conflicts in Cambodia, we talked about the resistance the armed resistance of the political parties who fought the occupation of Cambodia by Vietnam from 1979 to 1989, so 10 years of occupation by Vietnam. We also talked about, and we will never ever forget, the peace accord that was signed by 18 countries at that time on the 23rd of October 1991. It ended by signing the Paris Peace Accord. The 18 countries helped end for a moment the conflicts and allow the people of Cambodia the freedom, the liberty, the security, the safety to choose the leaders that they want in 1993. That elections that was free, fair, held, sponsored by the United Nations, so allowed over 99% of people of Cambodia, among them many thousands who returned from the refugee camps along the Thai-Cambodia border, to participate in the 1993 election. That allowed for the first time for the Cambodian people. At the time, we were about 14 million. We're now at 16 million. That election sponsored by the United Nations in 1993 allowed open the field for the Cambodian people to taste the freedom, to taste, I really mean taste it. But we didn't just taste it, but we helped put it together from the grassroots level, from the programs of human rights and democracy, of Radio Free on Tap, that gave the people of Cambodia the notion of what it is like to be free, to know the meaning of the taste of your food, the taste of the water of the well. Because before that, Cambodia was so torn by armed conflicts. The Paris Peace Accord also allowed the meaning of political parties, of opposition, of what the role of a national assembly, of members of parliament, of civil society, of independent media. That allowed me I returned to Cambodia after 18 years in exile. And I left and I went back and started a women's movement, then went into politics, was Minister for Women's Affairs, and then joined the opposition because I was not willing to continue with a government that is so corrupt. With the opposition, we were able to gain more and more seats at every single election, from the local level to the national level. How did we work as opposition in Cambodia to spread the seeds of democracy? That is very important to Cambodia. We were able to spread those seeds at the really remote level, villages inside Cambodia as opposition, because we stand for the values of human rights, the value of liberal democracy, and the dignity of the people. It is these values that stands with the people, the encouragement, the process of every single day we were campaigning not for us, but campaigning so that we can build grassroots democracy, so that Cambodia would not go back to Khmer Rouge, to genocide. We were allowed to, we enjoy democracy, plural democracy from 1993 until 2017, when the opposition, our party, was dissolved by Hun Sen, who has been in power for the past 35 years. He dissolved the opposition party because he did not want us to participate in the 2018 elections. And that's why Cambodia now has turned into a one-party state. And that's why in his report, Professor Vitit Montabon, the new UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Cambodia, just said a couple of days ago, Cambodia is fastly backsliding. Democracy and human rights in Cambodia are fastly backsliding. He called for the suspension of draconian laws during COVID-19, a law that could put a person who criticizes the regime up to 20 years in prison. That's about COVID-19. He called for the release of all political prisoners, including human rights activists, members of the opposition, including a 14-year-old autistic boy. We called for targeted sanctions against those members of the regime who have seriously violated the rights of our people, meaning land grabs, meaning corruption, meaning deforestation. We call for visa sanctions of those who are with the regime so that they shall not be put their feet on the soil. They should, their asset, soil in the democratic country, and their assets should be frozen. We continue to be very, very vigilant about the presence of the military presence of China in Cambodia. And because it affects not just the neutrality of Cambodia, but also the security of the region and of the world. I stop here for the moment, because I think it is more important for you to later on ask me questions that, especially on this, how to rebuild democracy in Cambodia. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Musakua. So our last speaker is Yawnghwe.
Thank you. Thank you very much for organizing this and for inviting me to speak. I will start by saying that sorry, I'm trying to gather my thoughts. I'll start by saying that although everybody at the moment may be focusing on the military coup in Myanmar and what is happening, the opposition against the military and the fight between democracy and a military dictatorship. I would like to say that that may be the focus externally, but internally, that is not really the case. First of all, I would like to say that Burma or Myanmar is at the intersection of three great civilizations, the Indian, Chinese, and Khmer civilizations. And all down the centuries, we have had conflicts in one form or the other between the different cultures, the different languages. And in a sense, we had kingdoms, different kingdoms competing to gain control of the region. So in a way, we've always had some kind of conflict going on. But all of that stopped when with the British conquest, and everything was quiet until the Second World War, when we had Myanmar or Burma being fought over twice, when the Japanese drove out the British and when the Allies came back and drove out the Japanese. So the country has seen a lot of conflicts. But since then, we have also had internal conflicts. Since independence, for the last 70 years, the country has never been at peace. And the main reason for that is that the majority Burmans, who make up about 60% of the population, have been trying to treat the other ethnicities and the other periphery states as colonies. And so everything is centrally controlled. Only the Burman language is the official language. No other official languages can be used. Burman culture is promoted, other cultures degraded. So there's always been conflict. And for the last 70 years, we have had different ethnic armies trying to fight both the democratic government and the military government in the country. And to put it into perspective, we are very concerned right now, rightly, that over 1,200 civilians have been killed by the military junta. Now, these are unarmed demonstrators who are going about their business without really doing anything. And we are very concerned, but nobody remembers that in the 7 decades, thousands of ethnic people have been killed by the same military. Not only that, in 2017, the same military committed genocide against the Rohingya people. And in that event, over 30,000 Rohingya were killed. I'm not saying that the killing right now is bad, but I'm trying to say that there are lots of other underlying issues. It's not just about democracy and human rights. It is human rights, but it's not just about democracy, because the military has been in control at least the last 50 years in Myanmar, and they have actually committed human rights abuses, violations with impunity the last 70 years. Their strategy is called the four-cut strategy, where to put down a rebellion or any armed insurrection, you target not the armed group, but you target the civilian population around those armed groups to terrorize the population into not supporting the armed groups, not providing food, not providing information. So from the very beginning, the Myanmar military has been using these tactics, which actually are crimes against humanity, but nobody has ever called them out on it. In any case, 10 years ago, the military decided to step down. They held elections, which everybody claimed were rigged, and generals became civilians, and they introduced reforms in the political system. Everybody was very skeptical, and they had after 5 years, they held another election where the Myanmar democracy icon Aung San Suu Kyi came to power, and we were all very happy and all very hopeful. Here, after all, is the person we've been campaigning for, we've been working. I personally worked for about 20, 30 years trying to get her into power. And the amazing thing is that after she came to power, the last 5 years, we had less democracy than the previous 5 years when it was being governed by ex-generals. And she actually used repressive laws more than the generals had done in the previous 5 years. So it's a real dilemma for us, people who want democracy and human rights, because the democratic government is not actually as democratic as the previous military regime. And that's why when the military claimed election fraud and seized power, a lot of people did not know what to do. Because first of all, they are definitely against military rule. I'm definitely against military rule. But I also do not want the NLD, Aung San Suu Kyi, the old democratic coming back to power and implementing their form of democracy, which was again very centralized and very undemocratic. So how did the protests start against the military? And I can tell you, it was not the NLD or Aung San Suu Kyi who started the civil disobedience movement. It was civil society actors. In the last 10 years, the civil society actors had really been able to improve their capacity, improve their organization, improve their communications with each other. And actually, the civil disobedience movement was coordinated by civil society. And that is, to me, the greatest encouragement, because it's not the political parties, it's not the, but the people themselves. Unfortunately, after about a month, the military started to crack down again using their known methods of just killing anybody. Now, and when that kind of suppression takes place, it's very hard for people to keep resisting without violence. The young people started getting very upset. They wanted revenge. They wanted to fight back. And then, unfortunately, from my point of view, the NLD government, the NLD party, was able to form what you call the National Unity Government to try to oppose the military regime. In one sense, it's good. It's a democratically elected government opposing the military. But in my opinion, human rights and democracy really took a beating, because they actually encourage, they said people have the right to defend themselves, and they can form armed resistance against the military. So now today we have more than 100 independent armed groups called the People's Defense Forces. And they are, yes, resisting the military, carrying out ambushes, exploding telephone towers and all of that, which is fine. But the problem is these groups have also, with the NUG saying that you should resist the military in every form, they have also started assassinating local administrators, even local government clerks going to work, teachers. So it's become a free for all. It's like you have a blank check, kill whoever you want, as long as you suspect them of working in collaboration with the military. And I think that is what I fear most of all, is that once you cross that line and you feel that you can kill anybody you think is on the other side, then that's a Pandora's box. You can, how will you control that later on? Even if Aung San Suu Kyi was freed from prison today, and she started to negotiate with the military or started some kind of a political process, who will control those 100+ armed groups? Will they even listen to her? Because they were formed independently. They now have arms in their hands. What will happen to democracy in Myanmar? What will actually happen to human rights? Because there's no due process. And most people are still not aware of it. The people who support democracy are actually cheering when they hear that a local government official has been killed. And it is common practice now that anybody who speaks out against all of these kind of killings can be designated a collaborator. And most people are now very afraid to speak out. And I'm really worried, and I hope that there can be some kind of a solution that, the situation as it is now looks like it'll get worse. Is there any way to stop the situation from deteriorating? Yes, we are definitely against military rule. We are definitely against the military having the impunity to kill whoever they want. But is it right for us to also become the same as the military? And I think that is a real dilemma. And I have no solution. Nobody does. I have been talking almost daily with colleagues in Myanmar and on the border, and those who are resisting, those who are trying to make some sense out of what is happening. But everything is very chaotic. Everything is very unpredictable, and nobody really knows what will come next. So, but I will stop there because I think it might be more useful to get questions and answers to help clarify my thinking as well, because I do not have an answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Han. That was a very insightful, as were all the speakers, giving us a lot of nuance and a lot of food for thought across East Asia and Southeast Asia. So I want to thank all the speakers for keeping the time. We're in very good time. It's 1:32, so we have at least a good half an hour for questions from the audience. And so I welcome now any questions from anyone. Please press the raise hand function, and I will call on you. Yes. I apologize if I mispronounce your name. Ake Sukapon?
Hi, Erik. Can you all hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So my question is for Tyrell, but I think others can kind of chime in as well. So Tyrell, it's good to see you. So I was thinking about the current pandemic, COVID pandemic. So I'd like to ask if Tyrell and others could comment on the impact of COVID on current resistance movements, thinking about how, or the extent of COVID and how that's either stalled or sustained resistance or changed the character of resistance in these different countries. But if Tyrell could maybe start. Thanks.
That's a great question, and I'd be very curious to hear about what this looks like in other countries in the region. I would say in Thailand, in a sense, COVID has mattered in two critical ways. One, the fact that the first 8 months of the pandemic were almost non-existent in Thailand in terms of infection, made it possible for the movement to come out into the streets, and I think for people to feel quite safe in doing so. So significant in that sense. And now it's significant again because in the last 9 months, due to let's just say dodgy decisions about vaccines made by the Thai government, and corruption in terms of who gets access, et cetera, there's been politicization, I think, of a much broader group of people who maybe weren't democracy activists in July of 2020, but have become them in 2021. I suspect there's a really excellent dissertation to be written on the intersection of COVID and politics in the region.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Yeah, can I say something? The situation in Myanmar actually is very, very bad because, first of all, people lost their trust in the military with their crackdown. So whatever the military tells them about the pandemic, they don't believe it. And most people think that if you go and get a shot, the military might be poisoning you. So a lot of people have said, I'm not going. So that has created a terrible situation where people are going to die just because they don't trust the military. And the other problem is that the military has also politicized it, when the international community wants to help vaccinate people, they say, yes, you can come and do that, but not for the civil disobedience people, not for the people in the opposition. That is and they have been arresting doctors and nurses who have been trying to provide general health care as well as vaccinations for people. Not under they're not working with the government, they're trying to do it independently. So there's a big problem now, but we are trying to get everybody, all those involved, to not politicize this, but to allow people to get vaccinated. And the different ethnic armed groups who actually have a ceasefire with the military have been able to help to get people vaccinated. Whether that will translate into a wider vaccination program is another matter. And the other problem is that the vaccines available in Myanmar are from India and mostly from China. And once again, the propaganda has been against the Chinese vaccine. But the problem is, if you have Pfizer from the US, you need a cold chain facility. You have to be minus 20 whatever degrees. And it's not available in Myanmar. Whereas the Chinese and Indian vaccines do not need those kind of conditions. And you need to be vaccinated no matter what. Don't wait for the right vaccine. But anyway, that's the dilemma we face.
Al?
Yeah, just very quickly, in Hong Kong, the first case of COVID happened in January 23 last year. So that was actually before the national security law. So there were still efforts for protesters to go out on the street. And indeed, June 4th last year, there were attempts to continue with the vigil for the June 4th commemorations. But of course, the government was able to use the pandemic and the need for social distancing as a way to prevent or at least limit the presence of protesters and gatherings, and as well. But of course, once you had the national security law on July 1 last year, then that's been certainly the motivation that has brought or prevented further protests in the streets. I would just add on the Philippines, one interesting aspect, since Harn has brought up the issue of vaccines. You have a situation where, in some ways, the whim of the leader has affected the way the vaccination rollout has happened. And indeed, it's affected people's lives as well as the confidence in the government and the sense of the competency of the government. Because the president favored Chinese and Russian vaccines to start, and that didn't really work out terribly well. And now, of course, the United States has come in, and then you have now Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, but in some ways too late, because if I just saw a ranking of COVID performance put out by Nikkei, and the Philippines is the bottom of 120 countries. So there we go.
Great, thank you. Sochua?
Yeah, COVID-19 has allowed Hun Sen to give himself a very good name by vaccinating over 80% of the population, including children under the age of 2, mainly with Chinese vaccine. We have spent millions and millions of dollars, so without any transparency at all. He has also been able to pass a law, because his party maintains all the 125 seats in parliament, a law that could put someone who is criticizing the government up to 10 years to 20 years in prison for anything. And in fact, over 100 people have been educated, re-educated, has to confess, and have been behind bars just because of their views about the handling of Mr. Hun Sen handling of the COVID-19. But what is really, really worrisome is that while this, what it allows the military and the armed forces and those big tycoons to do is to continue to grab land from the people under the excuse of development. And then when the people go to protest, they are imposed, they are punished by the COVID-19 law. In fact, at least two women are behind bars right now because they did not so-called respect social distancing while their lands are being taken away. One man was fighting for his land as well, and then he was put into jail, was imprisoned, and died of COVID. And who knows when the jails are infested with the virus. The situation for us in Cambodia, it is impossible, almost really impossible to protest, except for a group of women who call themselves the Friday Women of Cambodia, who have been protesting for the past 18 months for the release of their husbands, and they are very brave. But they go under a lot of physical assault and insult by the armed forces because they dare to resist, to be disobedient and to be dissident. But the courage for these women are really, really remarkable.
Thank you, Sochua. Kazue Takamura.
Yes, thank you so much for really amazing discussion, and really appreciated all the speakers, panelists, insights. And I'm thinking about the comparative aspect, particularly the state of human rights in Asia, and speakers discuss their own experience, but also insights regarding issue. But I'm wondering, we can also sort of ask sort of patterns of, I think it's clearly we can see similar patterns of punishment against human rights defenders, but also that wondering that we can see some common similarity between these cases, country example, and particularly, for example, Juan, his speech about Myanmar, speaking about the sort of different actors, right? So NLD and the military, but also new civil disobedience movement. And I think Cambodia's case also, you have, despite that very restrictive control of civil society sphere, at the same time that you see different actors try to contribute. And I think Ms. Mosokua, she herself is outside the country, and important to think about the diaspora's contribution to this human rights movement. Tyrell's talk about Thailand, also speaking about the students' role. So I was wondering that the sort of thinking about the sort of similarity regarding, role of new, actors in terms of advancing human rights in Asia.
Thank you. So whoever from the panel would like to take that question first. Harn, please.
Yeah, I would say, like I was mentioning, the civil disobedience movement, the civil society people on the ground, who are not either working for either the military or the political parties. It is really for the people's rights. And I think that's very encouraging. And the other thing that has encouraged me is the Rohingya people in Myanmar, because for all this time, they were totally ignored, they were persecuted, everything else. But those that have managed to escape and have managed to work from exile are now the ones who are actually bringing the case of the Rohingya before the International Criminal Court, before the International Court of Justice, and before also the courts in Argentina to bring up the issue of war crimes, genocide. And I think that is great because although these mechanisms take a long time, once they give a ruling, it is legally something that everybody would hold on to. And what they're trying to do is to establish that it really was a genocide and that there are people who should be held accountable. And I'm really encouraged by the Rohingya activists, both men and women who are very active today. You are muted, Erik.
Yeah.
Sorry, just realized it. Yeah.
Can I say something quick?
Yes, Hal. Oh, please.
Yeah, no, I just about identity politics, since kind of brought up. I think this factors in Hong Kong for sure, and in some ways, you know, we had these protests, similar street protests in 2014, the Occupy Central protests, and they were essentially really students and young people who were concerned about the democratic direction. They were generally peaceful. 2019 was somewhat different because I think what you had there awakened was concern about Hong Kong identity. And, you know, Harn was talking about Rohingya and all, but and herein is the division between the Hong Kong people who see themselves first as Hong Kongers and not necessarily as Chinese. And that isn't, I think, something that, again, I don't really know how that might resonate elsewhere, but it's an important aspect, the identity politics. And certainly, if you look at the United States and other places in even the developed world, identity politics has become a very important driver of protest and division, as it were. Thank you.
Thank you, Al. I'll ask Musakua to speak now to Kazuo Takamura's question. And if I can just append a further footnote question to Kazuo's question, the comparative question. So I know Thailand, I studied Thailand, and Tyrell can add to this, but clearly, you know, the student movement has been very, very important in the recent protests against military, against the reactionary conservative structure in Thailand. But it's not just university students, now also high school students have come out, and this is quite significant, what is going on in the past years in Thailand. I don't know as much in Cambodia. I know trade unions have been quite significant. So I was wondering if, in also addressing the comparative question that Kazuo had asked, if Sochua, if you could also address what is the role of students there? To what extent are they also involved, as they have been, say, in Thailand? Have they been less involved? If so, why might that be the case?
Yeah, before I answer your question, Erik, I would like to add another actor in this fight for democracy, or in the contribution to the oppression, or to the dictatorship, the private sector. Whether they are in with us or they're in with the dictators. And it's up to us to, we discussed that with the Hong Kong and the students in Myanmar yesterday at the Oslo Freedom Forum. Definitely, we have to be strategic. We have to start thinking about the campaign to boycott these companies, especially with the Uyghur, for example, where the clothes, the cotton that is used to produce these very expensive clothes sold in America or in Europe. This is something we have to consider. But also there are companies that have pulled out of Myanmar, and Harn can talk more about that. Okay, to the movement of students. Inside Cambodia, there is no such thing as anything that can resist, that can stand up. However, it does not mean that they are silent. Why? Because how do we know that? because we are from outside. We are very active on social media. We use Facebook with all in Khmer, but in English we use Twitter. We can see that the Mr. Sam Rang-si, the leader of the opposition in Cambodia, who is in exile, like me, he's in Europe. He has over 4 million friends. And for me, we have to remain very consistent. You have to give that message every single day, even just, and then be very brief but consistent with the message. Whereas we want, what do we want our people inside to wake up with and to go to sleep with, which is hope. No one dares to even stand up at the corner of the street. But if we say, okay, that is the situation, that's the status quo, that means that we're not helping, we're giving up. Why should, and then we are outside, we like, our party, the Cambodian National Rescue Party, has over 45 chapters all over America. We have close to 100 chapters all over the world, CNRP overseas. We train online. We stay in touch, very much in touch with our people inside. But we are also being careful because our people, when they are known to come into our training, are targeted and are put in prison. Many of them are in prison now for joining us. But does it mean that we should stop? No, we should not. Definitely not. I was in Washington, D.C. last week, promoting this action from a diaspora. And the global democracy cannot be, it has to be global democracy, especially in our countries where there is no such thing as standing up against dictatorship. But this dictatorship, we should not look at it as being strong. The dictatorship is weakened every single day because thanks to these, the coalition, thanks to these webinars and then these online discussions. But we have to be strategic on how, and when we, by region, with the region, I think we can cooperate, we can collaborate, we can learn from each other, definitely. And for sure, we should not be silent. And for sure, we have to be for us, the Cambodian Americans from this generation who don't want to talk about Cambodia, who don't care about Cambodia, who are happy to be in America or in France or whatever. Not all of them, but the majority who don't even speak Khmer. It is now the moment to really think about investing. And I am very proud to announce that, to inform you that the Cambodia National Rescue Party, the Women's Committee, the Women's Wing of the party outside is really, really moving forward, mobilizing women in America who are now independent, you see. They have their own jobs, they are independent, they drive their own cars, they pay for the tickets to come to our training. They mobilize funding for, and then they are very inspired to enter politics for the first time in their lives. Because of this situation, we will be demonstrating very loudly on the 22nd of October on the Capitol Hill, and then in Los Angeles for the release of the political prisoners. But in Los Angeles and in San Francisco, we will be demonstrating in front of the Chinese embassy to call for China to name China as the new. We don't want China military in Cambodia. It will be and because why? Because Hun Sen allows it to happen. And we cannot. That's why we also call on the signatories of the Paris Peace Accord. Don't be silent. The Magnitsky Law Act alone is not enough. The leaders, like in Myanmar, for example, same thing. What is ASEAN doing? What is the international community doing? Genocide is happening. China is in Cambodia. China is in the region. What is it that you're waiting for? the people cannot stand up. The people should be standing up, but be firm about your strategy. Don't keep on saying, building alliances, wait for this country, wait for this country, that country to move, and then we move next, we move later. No, there are definitely commitments, obligations, especially the signatories of the Paris Peace Accord.
Thank you. Tyrell.
I'm fascinated by listening to the range of new actors who are involved in pushing forward democracy. I would make just a brief note about Thailand, which I wonder if it's potentially relevant in other contexts in the region as well, which is that I think the role of students, both university and secondary students in this current present moment is somewhat different than the historic role. I mean, and Thailand has a historic role of student, particularly university students being involved in pushing forward change. I think the difference this time is that for both secondary and high schools, secondary and university students, they've all come of age entirely under military coup regimes. And so it's quite different, for example, than the generation of people who are in their 30s and 40s. So I think that's part of why the movement is so strong. It's about politics. It's also about people's individual futures and where they see the polity that they want to live in going. And so I think that's part of its strength and possibility and importance.
Great, thank you, Tyrell. I'm conscious of the time. It's 1:56. Could I ask, Min Sotawut to ask the question, and after that I will ask Wanarin to ask a question, and then I have one question that has been sent to me in writing, and I will ask these three questions to be put forth on the floor, and then the panelists can take them as they like, just in the interest of time. So Min Sotawut first, please.
Thank you for allowing me to have a question. My name is Thierwood. I'm from Northern California. And thank you for Madame Woshahu that described clearly about the situation in Cambodia. She also mentioned about the Pol Pot regime, but she did not focus mainly about the present regime that being pressed by the Hun Sen regime and the judicial killing at this present. And also I have a question about the internal affair from foreign occupation. While those power control all over Cambodia politics, I think the movement of democracy in Cambodia cannot taking place. She not focus on that, and I would like to have a question. I mean, an answer about the situation from especially from Vietnamese occupation, because right now in Cambodia government, I mean, we're not free. We are under pressure from those power. So every time we try to have or create movement, especially democracy movement, we are unable to do so. So I mean, I want some answer from all of the community today. Thank you.
Thank you. Could I ask Wanarin to ask his question? You're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Tell my Erik to take my question. My question is, like we know, everybody know, the world know that Southeast Asia is number 3 or even number 4, either number 3, number 4 of economy worldwide, in area of the Southeast Asia. And we know that what is the influence of China in this area. And many panelists already talk about Thailand, about Myanmar, about Cambodia, or even Laos, that is really a lot of pressure, a lot of human rights issue. I still don't understand, do you believe that the superpower country like United States, Canada, or even the Western country, to push the human rights and democracy in this area, because use this area as alternative of China, because this area can support economy, can support trade in alternative with China. We know that recently the China leader is really very arrogant, both military, economically, or trade, even Southeast or South China Sea military installation. Why do you believe the Western country should push more pressure of human rights and democracy in Southeast Asia in order to use as an alternative of China? That is my question. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. And I will ask the third question to the panel. This question was sent to me by Nu Trung, who is a postdoctoral fellow at Yale University, and she's currently on a train, so cannot ask the question orally. The question is this to the panel: to what extent does the democracy good and authoritarian bad dichotomy offer a useful lens for understanding the current state of affairs, or fail to do so? Han's comment that there had been less democracy in the last 5 years after Aung San Suu Kyi came to power, for instance, particularly resonated with me. Despite these tensions, through what alternative lens can democracy and liberal values still hold ground? So we have 3 questions on the floor. The first question is about possibilities of change in Cambodia. The second question is about the role of Western powers as an alternative to China. And the third question is the problematics, or the question of interrogating the good and the democracy good, authoritarian bad dichotomy, particularly in relation to some of the comments that Han had raised. I apologize, we will not be able to take any more questions after these ones. But if the speakers could take the just next 4 or 5 minutes to address any of the current questions on the floor. Sochua, please.
Yeah, I would like to address the third question. I think this is really imperative for people to not leave the power unchecked, whether it is from the opposition coming into power or whether it is for the regime continuing the authoritarian regime. The role of the citizens, the role of the voters that really does not end just after the minute you drop your ballot in the box. It continues. I think it is really clear where opposition sometimes, in Southeast Asia, for example, the liberals of Southeast Asia, look, once they are in power, do they act liberals? Or do they have to think about their political game, that political strategy in order to maintain power? It's the same thing. And we hope that, that's why I want to add something quickly. Our party leader, acting President, Mr. Samrasi, has been talking to the liberals in Thailand, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in Myanmar as well. We meet with Dr. Sasa from time to time and talk about a Southeast Asia community different from ASEAN, that it is really for the peoples, by the peoples of ASEAN and of Southeast Asia, meaning that we have to be true to the democratic values, the liberal values, and keep the check and let the people have checks and balances.
Thank you. Al?
Yes, thanks. I'll just be very brief, just make a few comments. One, With regard to students, I think it's important in the Hong Kong context to understand that, yes, indeed, we had a lot of very much younger students involved in the protests in 2019. And I think that was connected to this idea of identity. You know, many of these young people have grown up since the handover, since China took over sovereignty in 1997. And there's a disconnect in the sense that they really feel part of China, the country, and also they see many mainlanders coming to Hong Kong and living and working, and then they wonder about their future. Do they have a stake yet? I mean, will they be, is the competition too much with the mainlanders who are coming in? So you can't underestimate the kind of emotions that are involved in many of these things and that drive new players into the protest market, if you will, if I could put it that way. On China itself, I think this is going to be an interesting question going forward. China is clearly, projecting its model and trying to, I wouldn't say sell it, but at least saying, well, we have a very valid model of development. And that certainly is resonating around the region. What are the implications of that? There's the acceptance of the Chinese model as a valid one for development. Is that going to make space for civil society, for development democracy even more difficult? Is it a matter of, and this cues to the question about democracy, authoritarian sort of dichotomy, is it a matter of delivery and results and bringing good outcomes in a Singapore kind of way, right? That matters more in terms of addressing the democratic needs, the needs of people, the economic needs of people, the economic freedoms of people, or do they need more? And I think in the Hong Kong context, what the government here is hoping for is that they can now focus on economic and competitiveness initiatives that will somehow kind of quell the discontent that was revealed in 2019. Now, that's a good question. We had the policy speech by the chief executive today, and a lot of that is kind of more visionary initiatives intended to do that. Lastly, I would just note that we have to ask this question, in terms of, okay, China projecting its model, we see strains on democracy, not just in places like in this part of the world, but certainly even in the United States. And we have to ask, in Europe, what does this mean in terms of countries here seeing these kind of pressures on democracy? And indeed, in some cases, democracy kind of getting undermined. I mean, you see what's happening in states like Texas and Georgia and elsewhere in the United States. What kind of message does that send? Because, the concept of constitutional authoritarianism, I've made this argument, constitutional authoritarianism has been around a long time. And we're seeing the weaponization of the rule of law, not just here in Hong Kong, but certainly in the Philippines, in Singapore, in Mongolia and India, and this can really be the most challenging for citizens to navigate. The US notably, I mean, again, we see the weaponization of legal means of making laws that is creating actually pressures on democracy, even though they're constitutional. And I think this is really a huge challenge, how to deal with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Tyrell?
I just wanted to make a brief response to Nu's great question, which is that I think, and the comments by my fellow panelists confirm this even more. For people, I think, who are concerned about human rights, democracy, and rule of law in the region, we desperately need new optics. I think you're absolutely right that the often dichotomy between democracy and authoritarianism, and also particularly with the ways in which democracy and discourses of democracy have been manipulated by authoritarian regimes in the region, make it very difficult to use easily. So it's all to say, let's all create new optics for both understanding the kinds of repression that are happening and also being able to assess and understand the kinds of challenges to authoritarianism as well.
Thank you. And Han, would you like to respond also to the third question, since it
Right.
to some extent also comes out of your own from the said comments you made earlier?
Thank you. No, I think definitely what is needed is we need to talk about what do you mean by democracy. You know, most people, as long as there's an election, it's a democracy. That's not true, because democracy by elections has become more like a power game to get into power so that you can do what you want, not what the people want. And that is definitely not the kind of democracy we are talking about. We don't need top-down democracy. We need bottom-up democracy. We need more participation from the public. We need more inclusion. And how do you protect, in a majority situation, how do you protect the rights of the minority? I think these are very key issues. If we don't have any of these, then as Alejandro was saying, the rule of law and all of these become, they become weaponized. And I think we need to really examine what do we mean by democracy. And basically there is human rights. I think without the human rights of especially the minorities, you will get into trouble. Thank you.
Thank you. We are at almost 2:15, and it just goes to show how stimulating this panel has been, that we're still here discussing this. But we should take this to a close, and I want to thank the speakers for the really insightful and very inspiring talks. Reyes, who's speaking from Hong Kong, Tyrell Haberkorn speaking from Bangkok, from Thailand, Sochua from Rhode Island, Yawnghwe from here in Montreal. I really appreciate you all for your excellent insights. I also want to thank Kai Scott and Kip Jorgensen for their research help, and particularly for maintaining the IT going smoothly for this roundtable. And finally, all the participants who came out today, who asked really good questions, and who came out to listen to this very important group of distinguished speakers. Thank you very much. So thank you all, and I wish you a great evening or rest of the day.
Erik, 6,493 people have aware that we are talking.
Terrific. Terrific.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you
Good
so
night.
much, everyone.
Tuesday.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.